Hello and welcome, everybody. Here I am, Dennis Kiley, as part of this series of programming that we're offering with Ecopsychology Initiative that I have been calling Intimate Ecopsychology or Intimate Ecopsych. And to me, it's a chance to connect with other people, leaders in the field of ecopsychology in the various ways that people are getting involved in immersing themselves. And today I have the extraordinary privilege and treat to introduce my wife. And many of you in our community have heard me talk about her. Others might be watching this programming because you know of her and don't know who this strange guy is. But all that is to say that this is Johannah Blackman. I am so honored and excited to bring this woman who not only do I love personally, but respect so profoundly and deeply professionally. And Johannah is one of the more talented people I have ever met and has had backgrounds ranging from being an artistic director at a theater to doing marketing and fundraising and communications for nonprofits. But I think I'll let you say more, Johannah, momentarily. But when we had our kids, and even before that, you and I were both always very passionate around the planet and taking care of this sacred biosphere that we're all a part of. And it helped us motivate us to be part of another small group of people to start a Climate to Thrive, which is a nonprofit on Mount Desert Island where we live, that's trying to make our 4 islands in totality energy independent. And so I will just say that in the 5 years since we've had our daughter, you, Johannah, have just taken off in terms of your depth and knowledge and involvement as it relates to climate. And this can include with teens and young adults. You lead programming around that. You're put together a whole host of resources for parenting and climate change. You're now the president of the board of a Climate to Thrive, not to mention a myriad of other involvements. So I am just so humbled and honored to be part of a conversation. And I will just say that both you and I are planners and somewhat like to have things knowing what's coming. And part of the beauty and the magic and also the kerfuddlement of this is that we don't know what's going to unfold, but I am excited to just see what unfolds. So a special welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. And I will just add that it's been so wonderful to watch EPI unfold and to watch your journey with it unfold. And the one thing that I regret about it all is that you started it after we had children, which has meant that I can't come to any of the classes because I'm with our kids when you're teaching. So I'm excited to like dip a toe into the community via this and hope that I can do more in the future.
Yeah, I also hope that you can do more in the future. As I said, Johannah has so many talents and skills and passions. And I'm curious just to start here, like what is sparking you these days? Like what is bringing energy and vitality? And it can be around the climate movement and environment. It can be otherwise, but yeah, just curious what has your energy?
Well, I would say that specific to the climate movement, what has my energy is considering and being invited to consider how that movement might be blown open much wider to be more inclusive. And I'm seeing the climate movement already go through a pretty transformational shift right now and over the past year. And so I think it's already doing that work, but thinking even more about how it might blow wide open so that anyone and everyone is getting involved in a way that's really impactful. And so that's something that has me very excited right now. And then the other key piece of my energy is, of course, our children. And they're a wonderful inspiration every single day to be engaged in just life and in this work and teach, I know, both of us so much.
Yeah. Well, you touched on 2 points there that I would just run with a little bit. One is that I think I've tried to be as conscientious as I can be about racial justice issues, inclusivity generally and specific to the climate. And certainly in the last couple of years, my awareness has been blown open. And I've been offering programming on the psychology of climate change, whether around emotions or how better to engage for a while, and have always said that we need to be inclusive. And I was saying that largely for practical purposes at the time. It's just like, if we are going to get the type of mass mobilization that we need to be engaging everyone and not just kind of these small subsectors of progressivism and climate activists who are going to get involved. And yet now I'm realizing like, oh, wow, we need to be more inclusive because it's also about justice and it's the right thing to do, so to speak. And I think you've been a real you've helped open my eyes and encourage me and inviting me forward in a lot of ways. So I want to give you credit there. Not to mention that I think having children puts it a lot of this into perspective. It really hits home, not only like horrible pun intended in our home, but like in our hearts too, of like, oh, this is what it's all about. It's not just trying to benefit biodiversity or our own livelihood, but it's about these two young, precious beings and the many others on this planet who are inheriting a future that was no fault or responsibility of their own, and yet they're going to have to carry the brunt of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you touched on a both and there, right? That, you know, it's
how you know she's my wife.
That it's, you know, it looking at the climate movement and how to change it, to remove ways in which I think that there's been really strong gatekeeping around climate activism, and how to shift that to be more inclusive is not only the best way to make it more effective, it's also the best way to make it more just. And you know, we talked a little bit about this before we were going to do this talk, but I think that, you know, to tie it into EPI, you would, with an ecosystem, to my understanding, you don't have one part that's calling all the shots for the rest of it, right? That's defining the nature of that system. And the climate movement is a system. And if there are people in power who are defining what that movement is, even to the extent of like defining what we have to do to successfully address climate change, and it's like one specific lens that's doing that defining, then we're going to miss what we really need to do, because climate impacts everybody and it does not impact everybody fairly. And I think that some of the people who have the deepest level of experience of what's already unfolding with climate change, and maybe the best idea of like the nuances of what needs to happen to address it in varying types of community, are the very people who haven't historically been included in that movement.
Yeah, that's so well said. And I love that you're talking about it as an ecosystem, because I think it's true that, you know, in my lens, most anything can be applied as an ecosystem. And I think that there's been a way that it's been really hierarchical, and it's been a lot based on power. And even if some of those were very well-intended efforts, that the very structure of it has actually been part of the reason why I think we've had a lot of impediments and difficulties towards progress. And you know, you're familiar with me talking about psychological biomimicry, but one of the core principles is decentralization, is that instead of this notion of like one or two people at the top controlling all the strings, so to speak, we really need to empower the masses. And in that way, I think we are just uplifting people, and there's greater agency and involvement and effectiveness. Not to mention, it is a more just model. And I think we have a chance in the lens of the climate movement to see a lot of mirrors and patterns of what haven't served us in the past. And it's a lot of, you know, like I said, like this hierarchical, power-based and otherwise, that I think is causing problems in so many other areas. And the climate movement can't afford to have that type of inefficiency. Like right now, we have to work hard and smart and have kind of all systems a go.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, I recognize this in myself, that climate change is such an overwhelming and frankly frightening topic, that it's much easier to engage when I can quickly attach to one kind of program of solution and be like, okay, that's how we're going to do it. And then full steam ahead. And I now understand it completely. And now I can like control that narrative. And so it's very, it can be very scary to like blow open the narrative, because now we're going to create this narrative collaboratively, and it's going to emerge, and we don't know exactly how to address climate change. Because we know like what solutions need to be employed, but we don't know how we're going to actually do that, because we need to get everybody involved. And so we can't define the how in a way that shuts doors and leaves people out. But you have to let go of, like you said, the control to do that.
Right, exactly. And I think, especially with climate change, where it feels like we need to be acting now and getting everything done, you know, in some ways, the first step is to surrender, as you said, the control, as well as the knowing and the certainty, and to really be in this all collaboratively. I love that you chose that word, in that shared uncertainty, and living the question allows for an emergence. And that emergence, I think, is the only way that we're going to generate the types of ideas and strategies and solutions that we're really, that we're really needing.
Yeah, and I think that, the attitude of how we're engaging shifts. And you and I have talked a lot before about how fear is a powerful motivator, but it's like the fuel in the fire that burns out quickly. And I had, the joy, I'm going to use the word joy and then I'm going to use it again, of speaking to this incredible climate leader recently who talked about how joyful she feels engaging in climate action. And I was so excited to hear her say that, because I feel the same way. Like, I feel so much purpose and joy being in this work. And that is a much more sustainable feeling with which to engage. And that feeling comes from how connected I feel to others, but you can't, like, that connection happens when you let go of needing to control or define it. We have a visitor. Yes, come in.
This feels very fitting that you and I would be having our conversation, and I imagine it's our daughter who's visiting on rest time, so the impromptu guest.
It's okay. She's just picking out my clothes.
Of course, absolutely. 5 going on 15 and older.
But yeah, I mean, I think that, it's like that fear of changing your narrative and changing how you're working, that, like, when we overcome that, then we drop into this much deeper, connected, purposeful place of climate action, or of whatever it might be. I think this could apply to anything, any work that we're doing where we have to really hold control and, like, hold tightly to controlling the narrative around the work is not going to be sustainable, and it's not going to be joyful and connected. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll riff here in case Johannah needs to go.
I'm going to walk with the computer.
Oh, exactly. Yes, we have all types of firsts here. And yeah, it strikes me that you use the word joy, and I think we all need to find what sparks us, what gives us our bliss. And when we do that, we're going to be not only, I think, more effective, but it's also going to be more sustainable. And right now, that, goodness knows, that's what we need, is the sustained efforts at making a difference. And for each person to find what is their seed to plant and tend to. And as Johannah said, it might not necessarily be climate change. It could be anything for that matter. And so important that we are all really in touch with, where is my spark coming from? And to suspend any notion that it has to be this way, or it can't be, it can't be that way, as opposed to, like, what, as Johannah said, what brings you joy? And I think there's also another byproduct that comes from this that I mentioned earlier, this A Climate to Thrive that we're working with and has had great success. And it started from a core group of us feeling really disillusioned and, dare I say, almost hopeless about what was happening. And we said, all right, we're going to just find ways in our local community to get involved and be really practically oriented on solutions. But I will say from personal experience, and I wonder about yours as well, that the act of being involved in something that's local, where we can make a difference, is really empowering. And I think it's the greatest antidote to a lot of the despair that people are feeling right now.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. I think that connection, like, something as overwhelming as climate and anything else that's that overwhelming, like, you can only hold something that complex in community. And when you start to reach out to others, you see your experience, mirrored in different ways. And you also, like, realize what collectively you can do, but you also start to see, like, what your specific strengths are, in engaging in the topic, and it helps you draw those forward, and you get support to draw those forward. It's interesting, as I was, like, journeying to the closet and back, and I was thinking about another piece of this that, like, has really hit home this year around, like, letting go of control, as we've been in the pandemic and so many parents have been juggling kids and work, is, like, just tiring of notions of professionalism. And I think, like, really seeing the disservice that they do many different types of work, including, the climate movement, that, we have this idea of, like, how it should look to be professional, and, like, children should never pop into a screen, and we should never, like, feel. And as you mentioned, I've been working with a group of young activists, not just climate activists, but, like, different types of activists. And they've talked a lot about how they feel this strange paradox where they're often like called into moments of change making, like called to speak before a town council or to speak before a state legislature, because adults know that the young people will be emotional, and the power that like showing emotion, showing how we care about an issue has to really like motivate change. And yet it's not something that adults do very often or very well. And it can also be a reason that young people are then like dismissed as being credible participants in like actively creating the solution because they're too emotional. Yeah, so just like I feel like I spent a year of looking at all that, looking at like how can we come forward in all parts of our lives as our full selves, you know, honoring that there's spaces in which it's not safe to do so, and that we should never have to do something that doesn't feel safe, but that the world needs us to be more human, and more like connected to all of what that means. And I think that being more human is also like connected to being more animal in a way, like being more as we are as part of nature, not as we've like all these layers of, you know, different culture that we've slapped over that inhibit us.
Yeah, that's terrific. I mean, as you're talking, I'm reflecting on, you know, another core eco-psychological principle is wholeness. And we need to bring our whole selves forward into connection first with ourselves and then with each other and forward into the world. And I think that is a radical act of courage, because a lot of our culture, you know, pathologizes displays of emotion or vulnerability or not having answers. And so some of the very things that we're needing are being stigmatized. And rather, if we can bring that whole self forward, the part that is strong and the part that's scared and the part that's sacred and the part that's silly, like all of those have a role. Because, you know, I'm thinking about your work with some young people, and I had a chance to come talk about how to better engage using psychology. And I was saying that we need to be adaptive to our audience. Like, who are we talking to and what do they care about? And for some people, it's going to be a very serious, analytical, cognitive conversation. And for other people, they're going to respond more and be more persuaded by emotions. And other people, you got to incorporate some humor, or they just won't even be able to hear it. And so I think, to me, a lot of this comes back to, and I reflect on one of the previous intimate ecopsych conversations I had with Rachel Nixon. We were talking about humility. Is that I think a lot of the leaders in the climate movement have had this notion of this is the way to do it and this is the right. And rather, I think we need to be humble enough to say, as we said earlier, we don't know. And what's your passion and what is your strength and what does your community need and what is going to be most effective with your social circle and otherwise. And then do that, because I think without sincerity, people have a pretty good bullshit radar. And they just won't even tune you in if they feel like you're trying to manipulate them or in some way be disingenuous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it brings up two things for me. One of which is like what you were just talking about around this like kind of cookie cutter model of what it means to be a climate activist, which has like kind of historically been taken off of what it means to be an environmentalist, which is, you know, white, typically quite liberal, wealthy, you know, able to go outside, eating a certain way. And how that's just like being blown wide open right now. And I was talking with a Climate to Thrive's interns yesterday, and we were talking about, you know, gatekeeping in the climate movement and how even like getting terminology right, you know, what a form of gatekeeping that is, that like if you're not using the right terminology, or if you're not, you know, having the exact right goal, or if your behavior is not like looking a certain way, how you can feel like you don't belong. And talking with somebody who, you know, connects with all different kinds of communities throughout Maine, some of which, you know, she can't even use the phrase climate change, but the work that they want to do is still very similar. It's just talking about it in a different way. So that was something that came up. But also what was coming up for me is something, you know, you and I have talked about as well, that we have to figure out how to get comfortable with caring, and with like all the different emotions that come with how much we care about whatever it is we care about, which, like you said, will be different for all of us. But I know for me, I care about my kids, and I care very, very much about this earth. There's so many spaces, you know, outside and animals and plants outside that I really feel like I love. And you put the two of those together and like they're moving together into this future. And so I care very, very much about the future. And like there's so many feelings that come with that. And I think that for so many reasons we're uncomfortable with feeling at that level in our society today. But those feelings are like a radar. And they show, you know, what's important and ways in which the way we're functioning doesn't align with what's important and maybe what we need to then do. So they're so caring is so important.
Yeah. And it strikes me also that when we're trying to engage with others, having that radar for the other person's care is foundational as well, because for better and worse, the climate movement ties into everything. And so when we can find out what does that person deeply care for, what's their longing and yearning, where does their heart burst open, like to really meet them there and to help them see how whatever that is, whether it's family or finances or global geopolitical security or whatever it is, like it all relates to climate change. And so to the extent that I think you're right, we use caring as the radar, and not in a manipulative way, but really, as I said earlier, humility and or service of like, oh, like let's do more to care, to support the care, and then to care together.
For sure.
Yeah. Now I want to ask you, because you know, it's not public yet, but Johannah's working on a podcast right now, and you're getting a chance to talk to a lot of really wonderful climate leaders and otherwise. Not to mention, it's a phrase that you've coined, and I want to give you credit for. I love it, is this idea of can to will. And we know right now that the solutions are out there to address climate change. And the question is, will we? And will we have the political will? Will we take the actions, et cetera? And so I'm just wondering some of your observations, both from your own experience and those you're connecting with, like what is that bridge that we need to move towards will, because the can is already in place?
Yeah, it's funny because we're asking everybody else that, but my friend and I that we're putting the podcast together, we haven't answered it ourselves yet. So this will be fun. I mean, it's not a rant, it's just true. I'm going to rant a little bit, but it's true. The biggest thing between what we can do and what we will do is the entities that are still in power trying to prevent us from doing what we can. And so that would primarily be the fossil fuel industry and everybody who has historically benefited from that industry, whether it's, you know, large banks, large corporations, politicians, whole governments. And so I think that like the biggest hurdle that we have to get through is removing power from an entity that has been extremely powerful and has basically infiltrated and designed society to a point that we feel like we can't function any other way, and yet we can. And so that's like we have to remove that power, and then the question is how. And I think that, you know, it comes down to building a big enough movement to do so. And we were actually talking a little bit about this last night, that I don't think, even though it is becoming more economically desirable to be involved in renewable energy, and that's just going to increase. I don't see entities like Exxon or BP changing their mind and in a meaningful way. And so I don't think that they're going to hand over that power if they are not pressured by a huge groundswell movement. And it, like, we've also talked about this a lot, but I don't believe that climate change is the fault of of individual everyday citizens. And so anybody who's listening to this who feels like they have to obsess about their individual carbon footprint and that they are to blame, and like that can be a hurdle to even wanting to engage in climate change. This is not your fault. It is not your responsibility. Like, some very powerful people have done really horrible things to perpetuate and to create and perpetuate this problem, and knowingly done so. And so it is not your fault. But now we have to demand the change because they're not going to do it. And so I think that it comes down to narrative, and it comes down to blowing the climate movement open so that anyone and everyone can be a part of it, helping people find their individual, like you just said, what they care about and what they're good at, and what brings them joy, and what that means for how they're going to engage. And really, education is a huge piece. And so, really shining a light on what is happening and what is possible, and painting that really compelling narrative about what is possible, and painting it in a way that is inclusive. So people are compelled to join in, and then just never stopping applying that pressure and working for that change, and taking that power away and putting that power and those resources into getting the solutions on the ground and lifting up the communities that will need the help.
Yeah, that just so well said. I'm really glad. And I will, I want to also kind of give you credit that you've really helped me clarify just how important it is to assign responsibility appropriately to some of these larger, as you said, fossil fuel-based industries and systems. And I think it's true. And the disinformation campaigns that they have done, some of which is to overly deflect and or project responsibility onto the individual. And, in our conversations, again, of course, we'll come up to the both and of like, yes, individuals have a choice and a responsibility, but I think we have been misled into believing that it's all on our shoulders, while these large kind of corporate conglomerates and capitalistic interests have just gone about with total disregard and have made the problem so disproportionately worse. And I think you're right that we need to, in some ways, usurp those powers from those forces. And paradoxically, that is where I think individual power can come in. And I think one of the tragedies, these paradoxes, again, is that we come to feel so much shame and guilt of our carbon lifestyle and say, oh, it's because of me, and I'm taking this airplane travel, or I'm having occasional meat, or whatever it is. And while that does have an impact, I think as I said, there's been an imbalance to which we have prioritized that. And, the other end of that is that we don't feel that powerful. We feel the blame and the guilt, but we don't feel like we have a lot of agency. And I think that is one of the great travesties. And what I think the pivot needs to be now is to see where both individually and collectively we rise up and reclaim our power and assert that power and reshift the scales. And as idealistic as I can be, I can also sometimes be a little cynical or a little jaded. And it's sometimes candidly hard for me to imagine that shift happening in the time frame that we need. But in the course of, and parenthetically, this was a conversation around dinner we had with our kids and such last night. But in the course of that conversation, I said, I think what I know now about our society is it's so rapidly changing that, for better and worse, it is so misaligned with nature that it is happening at paces and rhythms that are not normally natural, so that there can be such a shift of consciousness and political will in a period of time that I can't foresee. And I think this comes back to something that we've talked about and that I've done in my work with climate psych or life as an ecosystem, is for all of us to really map out our ecosystem and identify the relationships and the places where we have real impact. And it might just be in our work. It might be in someplace else, but I think we underestimate where we have influence. And if we all were to prioritize just a couple of places where that influence could be received and could be impactful, I don't think there's any telling the ripples that could come from that.
Yeah. And I think that, we have talked a lot about this, like what is individual responsibility and what is individual power. And as like we've talked about it, and as I've reflected on it, especially this year, I think I've gained more clarity. And one of the things that I believe is that choices around like your individual behavior and your individual carbon footprint, if we hold those knowing that that is not going to tip the balance and that I am not to blame for climate change, and I do care very much about what's going to happen, and doing something like not eating much meat and shifting more to a plant-based diet, or having an electric vehicle if I can, or joining a solar cooperative, or putting solar panels on my house, or trying to drive less, like just feel like rituals throughout my day that remind me of what I care about, and that again soften me into that caring, so that I can stay, but holding that honestly, knowing that like that's not going to do it, that these are just reminders that help me stay engaged in the larger picture, because otherwise my day-to-day life would feel too dissonant with what I care about. And so, but knowing at the same time that the larger picture, like the most impactful thing you can do is join together with other people, because, and that's another example where I think like this is like an ecosystem. Like we're not supposed to, you know, do this by ourselves. If we're tackling something so powerful, and I really do believe that we can, it has to be collective, and we have to join together with others and celebrate that collective power that we have when we join together. And so, you know, I think that the individual action like is just it's a wonderful day-to-day like walk of my life, but it also helps me, you know, to stay engaged, to recognize where responsibility is. And I think that if I did feel like I personally was to blame for climate change, I couldn't stay engaged. I couldn't think about climate change. I couldn't parent my kids. Like, how do you talk to your kids about climate change if you think that you individually have created this problem? And thank God that's not the case, nor could it be, because why would any parent do that, you know, for their kids? Although I'm sure there's some parents sitting in executive positions at Exxon, so I'll have to ask them.
Yeah, right. Well, I hope we get a chance to ask them. And you were talking about the relationships. I mean, that is like one of the core features of ecosystems. It's all these diverse components in ever-changing and dynamic relationships. And I think when we're tapped into those, there's impact, but I say that secondarily to what you were talking about. Like there's joy and there's meaning and fulfillment, and it gives us a lot of the things that we need to keep going, which are ever so important. And I think part of what we need to keep going as well is to feel into our emotions, because unless we can hold and process the sadness and the fear and the grief and continue the list, the guilt and the shame and all that, like then we really will be debilitated, and we won't even be able to mobilize with others and or take the, you know, the small number of individual actions that we can take. And I talk a lot about this, but I'd love to hear kind of your talk, and not your talk, but your take on that notion that we really need to be with our own emotions and do some of that inner work as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when I was doing that research and writing around considering what parents might do in this moment to kind of prepare their children to walk towards this future that's coming, and not prepare in the sense of like arm them with like weapons, but more arm them with like characteristics and strengths and tools and ways of engaging with the world. You know, the two things that rose to the top for me were emotional intelligence, that we have to have emotional intelligence and the ability to feel emotions, and then a connection with nature, with the natural world. And the emotional intelligence piece, like it's real. And I think that a couple things that come up for me, one of them, I feel like I really learned from one particular young climate activist that I've been working with. And she talked about like times when she's felt burnt out and overwhelmed, and that she has giving herself permission to just take a break from needing to produce, and instead taking some time to just feel. And that is ultimately incredibly productive. But I think that, you know, particularly in white supremacy culture, we have this prioritization of a sense of urgency, and that's lends itself very naturally to climate work. And that, you know, we can feel like there's so much urgency, there's not time to feel, like there's not time to take a break to feel. But we're in this because we care. And again, it comes back to that, like we have to feel, we have to give ourselves time to feel and remember how much we love and how much we care. And so the first piece is taking the time and pausing and not needing to get anything done and being able to just feel, and then reaching out and connecting with others again as ready, and seeing and feeling how it's mirrored in other people. And that helps us hold it together, and seeing how they're doing their work. And so again, it's like, not that I have to solve this, you know, address climate change by myself. There are so many other people doing little bits and pieces that they're really good at and that bring them joy. And so if we all did that, I think it would get the job done.
Yeah. I just think we, this ecotherapy training that you gratefully were with the kids last night for, so you know about this, but we had the last webinar of this particular cohort last night. And one of the things that people were saying as they left is that they were taking and I felt the same thing. They were leaving with this sense of not being alone. And that even if they'll never see their fellow participants again, there was a connectedness that transpired that really refilled the well, so that not only were they leaving, in this case, professionally and personally enhanced, but they also were like, oh, there's other people doing this work as well. And I think that's so valuable that we need for the climate movement. And I want to, say that piece, but then I want to come back to what you're talking about with this young climate activist, and the conversation is, oftentimes there's this sense of urgency. And I juxtapose sometimes what I call eco versus ego consciousness. And I think a lot of climate change is a product of our ego consciousness. And it's a lot of things like production and consumption and more and scarcity and quantity. And I think it's just so infiltrated our psyches in these ways. And even for us as climate activists. And so it's like, oh, I can't stop and I have to keep producing, and it's more and more. And I think it is such a detriment that, one, we're going to burn out. Two, it's not about throwing more things out there, because goodness knows our society has enough stuff. It's more like what qualitatively, and that's qualitatively for our own well-being, but also qualitatively in the world around us. And so I guess I invite you to either respond to that, and I'm curious what you see as some of the qualities that maybe have permeated our culture that are really impediments for our individual quality as well as the climate quality that we're wanting.
Mm-hmm. Well, to what you were just talking about, I think that, the scarcity mindset and go, and I need to kind of hoard things, gather things, it is a natural mindset. Like we see it even in nature, when an animal or a plant is in a aroused state, it's that it serves a purpose. We're supposed to sometimes feel like, oh my God, I need to I need to do this quickly, and there might not be enough, and I need to get everything that I can for me. But we're not supposed to do that. No plant or animal is supposed to just live that way. It's supposed to serve a purpose. It comes from a place of fear, right? And so we've talked about how fear burns out eventually, and it's burning. That's been a cultural attitude, right? Culture wide, this focus on myself, and there's not enough, and I need to hoard everything for myself, and not even fully trust others, has been really, really prevalent, and is burning out because it's not sustainable in many ways. And it isn't sustainable as an underlying feeling in the climate movement either, that we have to take time to be able to look at the whole system and the structure that needs changing, and do that mindfully and consciously and in a way that engages others. And to engage others, you have to take time to build those relationships and hear from other people, and make those connections. So that's what comes to mind off of what you're just saying. And I don't remember the second part of the question.
Doesn't matter. That was good. Yeah, you can just drop the mic there. I like that you just said time. That I was already onto something else, but I was struck by that, because I think that's one of the greatest scarcities that we feel in so many areas, whether related to climate or otherwise. Oh, we don't have enough time. And so I think we can't make time, but we can take time, and how important that is. And I also really like that you pointed out that some of the qualities that I mentioned, let's say, of scarcity, for example, in and of themselves, they are not bad qualities, that they are part of nature like all of them, but we've taken them to such an imbalance. There hasn't been the both and that we're needing. And I think that, my fear is that we go to just the exact opposite end, right? And I think what we need is to say, we don't need more dualism. We don't need either this or that, it's black or white. We actually need a little more sustainable balance in terms of the values that we integrate into our world.
Yeah, and we need lots of different ways of seeing the world. And I think that's it, it circles back to that piece of not controlling how we approach this challenge, but instead, saying, okay, well, here's the way I see it, and here's what I care about, and here's what I'm good at. What is that for you? And then supporting each other and touching that way. And I think about with the Climate to Thrive and the ecosystem that organization is, there were certain people that were so necessary to be in leadership at the beginning, because there was a certain type of energy and strengths that were needed at that phase. And then we had a phase in the organization where we needed a different type of energy and leadership, because we needed to kind of more formalize ourselves and take time to get organizational structures in place. And we were able to like see that and speak to that both were valuable, and just different things are needed in different ways. And so it's not either or. And I think, you know, that's challenging in many ways. And it's especially challenging when historically, especially in this country, like right now, we're so polarized. And we have to think about, you know, that can't last if we're going to work together to try to survive, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I'm just thinking of a couple more, you know, eco-psychological qualities. That's kind of how my mind works. Of like, but one was diversity, and we know that the healthiest ecosystems are the most diverse ones. And so shouldn't be surprising that like diversity has been really devalued and punished, and you know it hasn't been a just or diverse global movement, let alone climate movement. And so no wonder we're having issues. And so can we embrace greater diversity as well as adaptation? Like we've all had, this is the way to do it, and we need to like be willing to question. And you reference, you know, within an organization, sometimes the needs and shift, so we need to adapt leadership or otherwise. And I think fundamental to all of this feels like communication. And I think of some of the political divisiveness that has happened is like communication has stopped, and we've lost the relational mindset and the communication that emerges from that. And to me, it's like, wow, if we might have to go to the basic starting blocks, you know, building blocks, and it would be, can we just talk to each other? Can we listen?
Yeah. And I think that like underneath so much of it right now is so much fear. And you know, getting to the point where people feel like they can come forward and say what they're afraid of. That's really, really hard to create, you know, a space where that feels safe. And I also like would always want to value the fact that some people are not going to feel safe, like have historically been so marginalized and treated so horribly that like they shouldn't have to be part of the conversation at first. But that there is a level of fear circulating right now that that I think is another key piece that might derail what we could possibly do if we came together, because there's a fear that's keeping people apart.
You know, I'm thinking right now of the Maine climate table and some of the movement the work they've done in the past, but now they're making this shift, and their new leadership. And I'm pretty sure the guy's name is John, and I'm so embarrassed that he's a phenomenal leader of the Maine climate table. And but all that is to say that what he was talking about is that he works and actively engages with people who you would not normally think of as being receptive to the climate movement. And what he said is the first step is to try and foster some respect and trust. And he said, when I can show them that I am genuinely there to be of help and to be listening, well, then all of a sudden there is a little bit of, you know, money in the relational bank, and they're willing to hear me. And so I do think that we have, as we start to engage, let's say the Exxon executives, they might not be reachable, but I think that if we come at them with this very punitive and shaming approach of like, you have to do this or you're bad for not having done that, I think it's going to alienate people. And that is not to say that we don't call and identify an injustice where an injustice is, and to call a spade. But I also think that how we communicate these things can be the difference between, oh, now that person is, you know, an enemy, or they're never going to work with us, and or like, wow, we're having some courageous conversations and it's edgy, but at least there's a mutual respect and we're willing to hear and learn and listen.
Yeah. I think about another interview that we did recently for the podcast that I'm working on with a recording artist, and she was talking about how she just feels like if she others anybody, then she can't possibly understand them. So if she others the executives of Exxon, she can't understand where they're coming from. Now, it's not to say that I want to, like, again, like you said, I don't want to condone their behavior, but I want to understand them, because I either want to understand if there's any possible way to work with them, or understand if there's no possible way to work with them, then I want to understand how to take them down. So you need that level of understanding. But I say that from like an incredibly privileged position where I haven't ever been othered to the degree that like my life and my ability to like provide for my children and have a safe place to live has been threatened. So there are some people who have historically been so, treated with such injustice in this country that like I firmly believe that they shouldn't have to do the first work of understanding. And so, want to value both at the same time. But I really loved what you said about, it's so important not to other someone that I would so like to just discount, like someone who's sitting, behind the desk at Exxon, because I need to understand them.
Yeah, and I'm glad you acknowledge that place of privilege, and I certainly need to include myself there. And it's easy for me to talk in the theoretical, right? Of like, let's not other and but I have been relatively spared a lot of the injustices that a lot of people have gone through, and so it's easier for me to talk about, well, if you're most interested in fostering relationality and communication and otherwise do this. But yeah, I think it's also important for me not to put out a formula, and I know you're definitely not, but for me to say, well, this is what all these other people need to do to really most generate the action we need, because that comes back to what we said earlier. There isn't a formula, and it's certainly not for I as a white man to be telling anyone else what it is. But, and so again, I guess it's that both and.
Yeah, you can know and feel like and sit in the truth of what you need to do and see the value it has for you and like the hope that you have from others, what you can recognize, what helps you feel connected. Because again, what we're talking about is like our need to connect better with each other, right? And build better relationships. And so I know what is effective from like what works for me, how I can open myself up for better relationship. And then I also like see what opens me when, how someone else can behave that opens me up. And I think that a huge piece of it is willingness to be changed through the relationship, which is key.
Yeah, we both, Johannah and I have been together for a long time. No, I think we're about 14 years, something like that, somewhere in there. And we had the chance to go to graduate school together and at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and ended up in the same program, integral counseling psychology program. And one of the reasons that I think we chose that is it talked about one of the best ways that you can help be of service in psychology is doing your own work. And so as you were just talking about that we can be transformed, I come back to, some of the underpinnings of, at least my early formative psychological studies and otherwise was like recognizing that like, oh, right, I can't just show up for someone else if I haven't done the work myself. Mm-hmm. I think the same is true in the climate movement. And that's not only have I checked my biases and my stories and assumptions, but have I done my emotional work? Like, have I sat with grief and have I sat with fear and all of that? Because I think when I have, not that the focus should be on the other and the impact there, but I think I will be more influential, not to mention that it then becomes just more regenerative and healing for me, this work, as opposed to just trying to fill a hole.
Yeah, for sure. And you're in a place where you're more ready to be changed, like even something like EPI, which is so outstanding and has like such core theories that make so much sense that, you might encounter somebody at some point. Well, I'm sure it happens all the time in a class where someone comes in and they say something, you're like, oh, that like makes me realize that this needs changing, or I am now looking at this in a different way. And we can get so attached to certainty.
Yeah, exactly. And you know me well, I get attached to perfectionism. And I think that is just, what is it? Perfection is the enemy of good enough, or something to that effect. And I think for me personally, like just keep showing up and keep doing the best I can, and to not think that I have the answers. And once I do, I'm thinking about in the webinar last night for ecotherapy, they were talking about Buddhist monks who create these beautiful, elaborate mandalas and such, and then they let them go. And I think similarly, like we never actually get there, and there isn't perfect. And so can we do the best we can, and then to be willing to let it go or have my mind changed?
Yeah, I just like had this image of our daughter building, something, and then as dads would know, our son would come in and just knock it down. And of course she's upset, but like she'd rather have him in her life and have that relationship than have the perfect block tower.
Yeah, it's one more example of our children are teaching us that, like, I often get more upset when our son Leo knocks over Gwenna's blocks than she does. And so it's like, okay, well, what's going on? If she's more adept at handling that disappointment, then clearly I have a lot to learn, not just from nature and my wife, but also my children.
We all do.
Yeah. Indeed. Well, Johannah, I am just so grateful, one, that you're in my life, and two, that you showed up for this conversation. And specific to that, I hope everyone who's listened to this recording has found themselves sparked in some ways, and something got generated for you, and that you had a chance to feel into why I think Johannah is just so wonderful and amazing, and really honored that you joined us. But want to give you a chance to say any final words that you might have right now that are kind of percolating.
No, this has just been so lovely. And I told Dennis going into it, this is going to be very, very weird because he's literally sitting right below me in the room right below me, and we're talking via Zoom so that we can share this. But it doesn't feel contrived, and it just, it feels like the type of conversations that we get to have on date nights only, because when we try to do them at, like we did at dinner last night, it gets interrupted too many times. So I just appreciate it. And I think that I'm so glad that you've created this community that draws forward many, many different people and celebrates what we each have to give.
Well, thank you very much. I guess I want to, I imagine there will be some people who've heard this and are really curious to learn and know more about you or be in contact. Do you have any information you would like to provide now? And if not, you can offer it up later and it can go in the notes or otherwise, for ways that people can be in touch and or learn more about your work.
Yeah, it's so funny. I like have all these things that I want to share that are not my work, but are things that I love that have moved me in my work. But I will, I haven't done a lot with it recently, but the pieces that I wrote around parenting and climate change are at Generation on the Edge. It's Gen on Edge, GEN on edge.org. And then I'll share, the other place where I share my writing that you can share in the notes. And would just say, like, for a lovely example of how the climate movement could look and feel, I think, or how I think it's going to look and feel. The book, All We Can Save, is so beautiful, by Dr. Catherine Wilkinson and Dr. Anna Elizabeth Johnson, edited by them, but written by many, many different female climate activists. And it's such a wonderful book to read. So I would hope everyone could read that. Yeah,
great. Thank you for sharing that. We will put these and any other resources that Johannah wants to offer. We'll put those in the notes. And in the meantime, our daughter is going to be finishing up her rest time soon. So we will.
Time's up.
Yeah, exactly. Time's up. Thank you for sharing this with me. Very, very grateful.
Thank you, sweetie.
Okay.